You will take the role of the crowd, and the men will take the role of the men. And Lahanda will be leading you as the crowd as we read through this. And I invite you to put emotion where it's appropriate into this. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying,
"Hail, King of the Jews."
And they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there,
"Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him."
When Jesus came out wearing a crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them,
"Here is the man."
As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted,
"Crucify! Crucify!"
But Pilate answered,
"You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him."
The Jewish leaders insisted,
"We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God."
When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace.
"Where do you come?"
He asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer.
"Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?"
Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." And from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting,
If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king oppresses Caesar.
When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon.
"Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews.
but they shouted,
Take him away, crucify him.
"Shall I crucify your king?"
Pilate asked.
We have no king but Caesar.
Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross, which read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying,
So you are going to destroy the temple and build it back in 3 days. Come down from the cross and save yourself.
In the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law mocked him among themselves, saying,
He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe.
At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And when some of those standing near heard this, they said,
Listen, he's calling Elijah.
Someone ran, filled with the sponge, the wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone," he said. "Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down." Then with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God."
Please be seated. It must have been quite the delegation that assembled that morning on the front porch of the governor's palace. All the chief priests of the temple were there, the archieres, the archpriest, who knew all about offering sacrifices. That's what they did. Along with them were the elders of the nation, the presbyteron. We call them Presbyterians. That's not exactly fair. Those of us wearing these black robes tonight are actually presbyteron. We're elders, or at least elders to be, in the Methodist Church, just as they were in the nation of Israel. The scribes were there too, the dramaton, the court reporters, the ones who could write really well. According to St. Mark, all the governing council, the Sundrahin, the Sanhedrin, had come along. And don't you know that old Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, must have wondered to himself, what fresh hell is this, when they came knocking on his door before he'd even had time to finish his Roman post toasties, his Caesar crunch, his salted fish for breakfast. But these men were on a mission. They couldn't wait to tell old Pilate about Jesus, who they had hated for calling himself the Son of God. That's not what they told Pilate, of course. They told him that Jesus said he was the King of the Jews. You got to know your audience, don't you? Pilate would not have cared one whit about Jews' theological disputes. But claiming kingship, well, that was something different altogether. Something bound to get a Roman governor's attention. Only Pilate pretty quickly figured out that Jesus was not really a threat to anyone, much less to the imperial court of the mighty Roman Empire. He was amazed, in fact. He marveled at how those accusers kept on making up things about him. The word for accuse here is actually kategoron. They categorically came up with one phony charge after another, all kinds of categories of charges. But still, Jesus never even bothered to say one word in his defense. Pilate tried to release him thus. And as we talked about a few Sundays ago, he had to get out. Some silly old custom he had inherited when he became governor, a practice that had been meant to placate a restless populace as a sign of Rome's magnanimity. He could grant absolute amnesty to one prisoner every year at Passover. But the crowd, the mob, you know, the ones that you just played, they wanted the governor to pardon a known murderer and rebel named Barabbas instead. Anybody could see, plain as day, what was going on that day. It was pure envy, nothing more, nothing less, that was pushing the priests to act as they did, and Pilate knew it, but they still wouldn't back down. And so finally the Roman governor sighed deeply, gave them what they wanted. The soldiers had a little fun with Jesus. They put a purple robe on him, made a crown out of thorns, stuck it on his head. They even bowed down and pretended to worship him. But then they stripped him down once more. They tied his hands behind his back. They drafted some poor schmuck from the sticks that just happened to be passing by that day, got a little too close to the whole scene, to carry the heavy crossbeam that Jesus, already weakened by his loss of blood from the beating and the scourging, couldn't handle. They led him off to the place of the skull. A British general by the name of Charles George Gordon thought he found that place in 1883. When he came across just outside Jerusalem a rocky escarpment, you can sort of see a skull in it. It's now just behind a bus station. Others have thought that before him as well. Others still think that, though the archaeological evidence seemed to suggest something else. But wherever it was, when they got to that place, they hoisted Jesus up on a splinter-filled saber, and there he hung for 6 hours from about 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. Those chief priests and teachers of the law watched the whole process, and they couldn't resist still taunting the one who had been their adversary for so long, beating them in all the polls when it came to favorable, unfavorable ratings. Jesus had made them look bad. Jesus had made them look petty. There's no pride so vindictive as spiritual pride, especially when it's coupled with one's own sense of self-preservation. Strangers who passed by the scene hurled their insults up as well. Heavens, even some of the other criminals being crucified that day, and there was a bumper crop of crucifixions that day because of Passover, all kinds of thieves and robbers and murderers and rebels, they heaped their insults on Jesus too. But the man in the middle just kept hanging there without making any response back to his attackers. The other Gospels will tell us that Jesus uttered 7 rather famous last words or sayings from the cross that day. St. Mark, in his customary brevity, only gives us one of them. Saying that in the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani? My God, why have you forsaken me? And it must have seemed that way, don't you think? If anybody should have had an inside track with God, it was this man, Jesus. It's only right to expect that God, in turn, would have stood by him in his moment of need. And even if he had to suffer, that Jesus should at least have been able to know that God was with him. But quoting the words of that ancient Psalm 22, Jesus clearly seemed to feel that as he hung there, that when all had been said and done, when all the miracles had been performed, when all the demons had been cast out, when all the sick had been healed, when all the dead had been raised, when all the truth had been proclaimed, when he had done all that the Father sent him here to do, that at the end of his life, he was indeed all alone. Maybe you've been in that awful place. Many years ago, a young Midwestern lawyer suffered such a deep depression, felt so abandoned, so sunk in abject despair. His friends and family hid all the knives and razors in the house from him. He told others he was the most miserable man alive, and he could not say if it would ever be better. He feared it would not be. He was wrong. That young lawyer went on to become one of America's greatest leaders, Abraham Lincoln. Wouldn't we love to have a man like Abraham Lincoln to vote for today? But at the time, those feelings of abandonment, those feelings of abject depression that Abraham Lincoln experienced were powerfully real, just as they may be real in each of our lives from time to time as well. Which is why they had to be real for Jesus that day on the cross as well. You see, Jesus took upon himself the sins of the whole world. The essence of sin is always loneliness and feeling cut off from God, even if we're the ones who cut ourselves off. And so Jesus simply hung there, his life, his spirit, being drained from him with each passing painful moment. And this is the one spot in his gospel where you will not find that Mark tells us that something happened, kai uthos, and immediately. Because I have a feeling It was agonizingly slow. Until with a last loud cry, Jesus simply stopped breathing. Now, we don't know if the chief priest and the scribes and the teachers of the law and the elders of the nation were all still there in the killing fields when he died. I have a feeling at least some of them were, lest their lust for revenge had so consumed them they could not be content until they saw Jesus die with their own two eyes. But if others of those folks had gone back into the city and they were busying themselves in the temple, getting ready for the Sabbath, the conclusion of the Passover feast, they must have known that something happened in that very moment as well. For not only did the veil of the temple curtain, the curtain which separated the inner court of the Holy of Holies from the outer courts of the women and the courts of the Gentile, that textile marker between us and them for the Jews, some might have called it a great, big, wonderful, woven wall. Not only was the curtain torn in two from top to bottom, the other Gospels tell us there was an earthquake that rattled the city as well. To make it even stranger, St. Matthew says that some of those who had long since been buried in the tombs from a nearby graveyard came out of their crypts when the tombs broke open from the earthquake. They went back into the city. Then that must have been a very awkward moment. Hi, dear, who's the new husband? Nobody knew what to say. All except for one of the Roman guards who had been given execution duty that day. No one knows his name. We could call him simply the unknown soldier if we like. Mark tells us he was a Centurion, which means that he would have been a non-commissioned officer in the Roman army. Centurions were the captains of 100 other men. And within a Roman legion, there would normally have been about 60 such centurions. They each carried around a staff of vine wood as their sort of badge, though I suspect in an occupied city like Jerusalem, everybody knew who they were. They didn't need any kind of badge or symbol. Given the restive population, theirs was a very difficult job, especially when their task was to preside over the public execution of other people via the cruelest of all methods, crucifixion. So most of those Roman soldiers, even the centurions, had long since learned how to shut it all out, to depersonalize their victims, to grow callous and insensitive to the pain of other people, lest they go a little crazy themselves. How could you not? How could you do this job every day if you didn't seal up something so that it couldn't get to you anymore? But when this unknown soldier, when this Centurion who stood in front of Jesus heard his final cry and saw how he died, he couldn't help himself. Surely, this man was the Son of God. Aleithos, in truth, veritably, verily, most certainly, demonstrably, in accord with fact, without any question. This man, anthropos, huios, theos, the Son of God was. And it strikes me, my friends, that's the whole point of what happened on the last day when Jesus walked among us, at least before his resurrection. Oh, we say it all the time. I wonder if we have a clue what it means. Jesus was the Son of God, and he died for you and me. But until we accept that fact, internalize it, it won't mean a thing. a bit like Garrison Keillor says about his childhood holiday meals when the whole family gathered around the table, and maybe you're going to have one Sunday. He said on those occasions his Uncle John usually gave the prayer. I had an uncle that usually gave the prayer, Uncle Robert. He was Church of Christ. He was the most religious person in our family. And when I was ordained, I spiritually leapfrogged over Uncle Robert and became the designated prayer, the DP of the family. Uncle Robert never got over that. Keillor says everybody in his family understood that his Uncle John couldn't pray without talking about the cross and crying. Made everybody uncomfortable. And then Keillor adds this powerful observation. He says, all of us knew that Jesus died on the cross for us, but Uncle John had never gotten over it. Oh, my. I have a feeling the Roman Centurion never got over it either. I have a feeling you and I should never get over it either. On the last day of his life, Jesus went to the cross. He paid the penalty for our sins. So the question tonight is, have you and I accepted that offer of grace for ourselves, or have we just gotten over it? If we have genuinely acknowledged what Christ really did, then what happened on Good Friday will be forever etched in our minds. We won't forget it either. As painful as it is sometimes on days like this to remember it. But if we have not accepted what Christ did on our behalf, then we leave Jesus all alone on the cross. And so in turn, he must leave us all alone in our own sinful selfishness. We are like those who stood around and hurled insults that day are equally damning. We are like those of whom the ancients long ago wrote, "Is it nothing to all you who pass by?" Those words haunt me every Good Friday. Is it nothing to all you who pass by? Tonight, let it be something. Even if it's something a little painful. And make no mistake, as Tony Campolo would say, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. And when it gets here in 2 days, we're going to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ like nobody's business. I hope you'll be here. The truth is that God's plan for you and me in this world did not end in the cul-de-sac of a borrowed Palestinian grave 2,000 years ago. Yet on the last day of his earthly life below, Jesus showed us that even if everyone else is against you, and indeed, even if you can't quite see God or feel him or sense his presence with you, that God is still at work. You see, my friends, like that Centurion, the Centurion, the confession that we have to make tonight is that our God can take even the absolute worst of days and make it yet God's Friday, a Good Friday for all those who love him. This is not just the day Christ died. This is the day death died. This is the day death. I have a feeling whoever came up with TGIF had no earthly idea what they were talking about. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.